General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe. For this victory, we join in offering our thanks to the Providence which has guided and sustained us through the dark days of adversity and into light. Much remains to be done. The victory won in the West must now be won in the East. The whole world must be cleansed of the evil from which half the world has been freed. United, the peace-loving nations have demonstrated in the West that their arms are stronger by far than the might of dictators or the tyranny of military cliques that once called us soft and weak.
In the years following World War II, a small group of industrialists, planners, and government officials began shaping a transportation future that would redefine the United States. They met in corporate boardrooms, federal agencies, and planning commissions. Their conversations were not secret, but their consequences would be far-reaching. Among them was Henry Ford, whose mass production of automobiles made private car ownership attainable for millions of Americans. Alfred P. Sloan, president of General Motors, who believed that the automobile was not simply a product, but the organizing principle of modern life. Charles E. Wilson, head of General Motors, who would later serve as Secretary of Defense, linking industrial capacity, national security, and federal policy. Alongside influential planners like Robert Moses, whose highway projects reshaped American cities to prioritize the movement of automobiles over people. Together with oil companies, tire manufacturers, trucking interests, and the construction industry, these figures advocated for a transportation system built around the private car. They promoted highways as engines of economic growth, symbols of progress, and necessities of national defense. The result was the Interstate Highway System, one of the largest public work projects in human history. The story is often told as a tale of manipulation, that a powerful highway lobby deceived Congress and dismantled the public transportation in order to sell more cars. The historical record tells a more complicated story. The shift towards automobiles was not imposed by an unwilling public. It was embraced by policymakers, by voters, and by a social class that equated mobility with freedom. But that choice came with consequences. By the early 1950s, most American transit systems were still privately owned. They operated as businesses, not public services. The revenue came almost entirely from fares, and as car ownership increased, ridership steadily declined. This placed transit companies in an impossible position. As fewer people rode, companies raised fares and cut services. As service worsened, even more riders left. Maintenance was deferred, equipment aged, and in many cities, streetcars still in use daily had been built before the First World War. A clear example of this decline can be seen in the Pacific Electric Railway in Southern California. Once the largest electric railway system in the world, Pacific Electric operated more than 1,000 miles of track, connecting Los Angeles to surrounding cities and suburbs. For decades, it was profitable and widely used. But by the late 1940s, ridership had collapsed. Cars offered flexibility. Suburban development spread beyond the reach of fixed rails. Revenue fell, maintenance was postponed, and service steadily deteriorated. By the early 1950s, Pacific Electric was no longer expanding. It was shrinking. Despite mounting pressure from city governments, transit companies like Pacific Electric received no meaningful public assistance. Federal subsidies for private companies were politically unpopular. Transit, after all, was still technically profitable in many cities, although barely. And without a visible crisis, there was little reason in Washington to intervene. The American Transit Association, which represented these companies, focused its lobbying efforts not on federal investment, but on avoiding new taxes. As Congress debated funding mechanisms for a national highway system, the ATA sought exemptions from proposed highway user taxes, arguing that transit vehicles made minimal use of federal roads. And they got what they asked for, but in doing so, they also made a critical concession. Earlier planning documents and testimony from the 1940s had envisioned urban highways that would accommodate transit. Planners discussed exclusive bus lanes, turnouts for passenger loading, and even reserving space in highway medians for future rapid rail lines. The idea was not that highway would replace transit, but that they would coexist. The ATA itself had supported this concept in earlier congressional testimony, but yet during the crucial years leading up to the Interstate Highway Act, those arguments largely disappeared. By emphasizing that transit systems were non-users of highways, the industry weakened its own claims to inclusion. Proposals to incorporate transit infrastructure into the new freeway system were quietly set aside, not because they were impossible, but because no one was insisting on them. And by the time the interstate system moved from a concept to construction, highways had become a single-purpose instrument. By the mid-1950s, the question was no longer whether the United States would build a national highway system, the question was how large it would be, and what it would prioritize. The decisive shift came from the top. President Dwight D. Eisenhower had first-hand experience with the limits of American roads. In 1919, as a young Army officer, he participated in a military convoy that took more than 2 months to travel from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. Bridges collapsed, roads disintegrated, vehicles broke down. The journey revealed how unprepared the nation was for large-scale mobility. However, during World War II, he witnessed the opposite in Germany's Autobahn system, limited-access highways designed for speed, durability, and military logistics. These roads allowed troops and equipment to move quickly across long distances. Eisenhower never forgot the contrast. In the emerging Cold War, that lesson became policy. Highways were no longer framed primarily as transportation infrastructure. They were framed as a national defense infrastructure, routes for evacuating cities, corridors for moving troops, a backbone for economic resilience in the event of attack. This framing changed everything. When the interstate highway system was proposed under the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, it was presented not as convenience, but as a necessity. A project too important to fail, too urgent to delay, and too large to compromise. The scale was unprecedented. Over 40,000 miles of limited access highways, funded by a dedicated highway trust fund, insulated from annual congressional battles. User taxes on fuel and vehicles would pay for construction. Once approved, the system would move forward automatically. Transit, by contrast, had no such mechanism. As construction began, priorities hardened. Proposals to include rail and highway medians or reserve space for future transit were deemed unnecessary complications. Anything that slowed the construction or increased costs were quietly eliminated. Speed mattered, uniformity mattered, and cars mattered. And once concrete was poured, those decisions became permanent. Highways reshaped metropolitan America at a scale few policymakers fully anticipated. Suburbs expanded outward, following the new roads, jobs decentralized, shopping centers relocated, and daily life reorganized itself around the automobile. For those who could afford the car, the system delivered exactly what it promised. But for those who could not, the consequences were immediate. When the interstate highway system reached American cities, the damage was not incidental. It was structural. Highways needed space, wide continuous corridors that could move traffic at speed in dense urban environments. That space had to come from somewhere, and planners consistently looked at the same places. Neighborhoods with the lowest property values, communities with the least political power, areas already labeled as declining, blighted, or obsolete. In practice, this meant black neighborhoods, immigrant enclaves, and working-class districts. Across the country, the urban highways cut directly through the fabric of cities. In Detroit, Interstate 375 destroyed the heart of the Black Bottom neighborhood, once a thriving center of black commerce and culture. In New Orleans, the Claiborne Expressway was built over a tree-lined boulevard that served as a gathering place for the city's black community. In Miami, Interstate 95 split Overtown in half, displacing thousands of residents and businesses. These decisions were not accidents of geography. They reflected the political reality. Affluent suburban communities had the resources to resist highway construction. Poor urban neighborhoods did not. When objections were raised, they were often dismissed in the name of progress. The highways would bring jobs, growth, and modernization. The benefits, the planners argued, would outweigh the costs. But the benefits rarely flowed back. Homes were demolished. Businesses were closed. Property values collapsed. Communities that had taken decades to build were erased in a matter of months. What remained were physical barriers, concrete trenches, and elevated roadways that isolated neighborhoods from the rest of the city. For residents without cars, these highways offered no mobility. They offered separation. For white, middle-class families leaving the city, the automobile represented freedom. Freedom from congestion, freedom from density, freedom from what cities had come to represent. For many black Americans, the car-centric system imposed limits instead of lifting them. Without access to suburban housing or reliable automobiles, mobility narrowed. Economic opportunity followed the highways, while transit-dependent communities were left navigating a shrinking network designed to serve someone else. Homeownership in the suburbs became a primary engine of generational wealth in the post-war America. Those excluded from that system, by policy, by finance, and by design, were locked out of its returns. By the time the consequences were fully visible, the system was already complete. The roads have been built, the cities have been divided, and the assumption that everyone would drive had become embedded in American life. While cities were being reshaped and transit systems quietly faded, a different set of institutions were thriving. The rise of the automobile-centered transportation system created a clear and consistent set of winners. At the center were the automobile manufacturers: General Motors, Ford, Chrysler. By the mid-1950s, car ownership had become a defining feature of American life. Each new highway mile extended the practical range of the automobile, opening new markets and reinforcing dependence on private vehicles. Surrounding the automakers was a broader coalition of interests often referred to as the highway lobby. Oil companies benefited from increased fuel consumption. Tire manufacturers like Goodyear and Firestone profited from constant wear and replacement. Construction firms secured massive, long-term federal contracts. Trucking companies gained faster and more reliable routes for freights, undercutting railroads in both speed and cost. And none of this required secrecy. These industries openly advocated for highway expansion, framing it as an economic development, modernization, and national progress. Public relation campaigns reinforced the idea that highways were symbols of freedom and prosperity. Exhibits like General Motors' Futurama, first unveiled at the 1939 New York's World's Fair, imagined a future of sprawling cities connected by flowing superhighways, clean, efficient, and most importantly, car dependence. The corporate influence extended directly into the government. As Charles E. Wilson, president of General Motors, became Secretary of Defense under President Eisenhower, his tenure symbolized the close alignment between industrial capacity, federal planning, and Cold War strategy. Wilson famously stated that what was good for General Motors was good for the country. It is important to note here that these corporations did not secretly engineer the collapse of public transit. They did not need to. The system rewarded their interests automatically, as highways amplified automobile use, and automobile use justified more highways. By the time critics began questioning the consequences of the congestion, pollution, and inequality, the beneficiaries of the system were deeply entrenched. Jobs depended on it, profits depended on it, and entire regions and towns were built around it. The transformation of American transportation was not the result of a single secret meeting or a hidden conspiracy. It emerged through open, overlapping relationships between industry, government, and planners. Automobile executives moved between corporate boardrooms and federal offices, and engineers designed what they were trained to build. Military leaders, shaped by wartime logistics and the example of Europe's Autobahn, framed highways as a matter of national defense. Congress, responding to suburban voters who already owned cars, funded what the public was eager to use. Automobile manufacturers sold millions of vehicles to a public increasingly required to own one in order to participate in daily life. Oil companies benefited from a nation structured around constant fuel consumption. Tire manufacturers, road builders, trucking firms, and suburban developers found reliable, long-term demand for their product and services. The federal government gained a transportation system that supported military mobility, industrial logistics, and post-war economic expansion. For middle-class and affluent Americans, disproportionately white, this system delivered freedom, convenience, and access to newly built suburbs. For them, the automobile was not a burden. It was a promise fulfilled. But that promise was not universal. Those who lost were often invisible in the planning documents. Urban residents who could not afford cars were left with transit systems stripped of investment and flexibility. Black Americans, already excluded from suburban home ownership through redlining and discriminatory lending, remained concentrated in cities, increasingly fractured by highways that cut through their neighborhoods. Communities were displaced in the name of urban renewal. Their streets widened or erased to make room for traffic that passed through rather than served them. Transit riders were treated not as customers to be retained, but as a cost to be minimized. The system assumed choice where none existed. Highways were framed as a neutral infrastructure. Cars were framed as a personal preference, but the environment ensured that opting out was rarely possible. The pursuit of growth rewarded speed over access, distance over density, and private ownership over shared systems. America did not just buy the car. It built a country that required one, and we're still paying for that choice. If you found this interesting, go ahead and check out my other video on why American bars have parking lots as opposed to European bars. My name is Kevin, and I like to talk about things that I find interesting. If you're still watching, you should maybe subscribe if you haven't already, and if you want to do your own research, below I have listed my sources. Have a nice rest of your day.